and raids follow the London Underground bombing linked to at least 2 previous terror attacks across the UK, reportedly the work of the same exclusive network. Russia says Syrian army units have crossed the Euphrates River in their bid to recover eastern Syria, despite warnings from the US-backed Syrian militia. And it's known as the Galapagos of the Middle East, but this UNESCO-listed heritage site is set to be transformed into a major military base. Hello, I'm Gabrielle Weiniger. Welcome back to this week's edition of Debka Files, exclusive news, insight and analysis from the Middle East and around the world. Now to our top headline, and the Parsons Green tube bombing in London last Friday is linked to at least 2 former terror attacks in the UK, reportedly the work of the same exclusive network. This, according to Debka File's counter-terrorism sources. This was indicated by analysis of the so-called bucket explosive, which injured 30 commuters. 2 previous attacks linked to the network took place in Manchester. 4 men were arrested after a bomb full of nails and screws was detonated outside a cafe earlier this month. The other attack took place in another Manchester neighbourhood last January. But the Parsons Green device, which did not fully detonate, has a new refinement: a timer. 2 men, aged 18 and 21, were arrested in connection with the bombing, ISIS claiming that attack. In the meantime, the UK National Terror Alert has been lowered to severe. A British official had this to say about the terror threat.
Well, following the attack in Parsons Green last Friday, the police have made good progress with what is an ongoing operation. The Joint Terrorist Analysis Centre, which reviews the threat level that the UK is under, have decided to lower that level from critical to severe. Now, severe still means that an attack is highly likely, so I would urge everybody to continue to be vigilant but not alarmed. As the Prime Minister said last Friday, the military were called to support the police so that armed police officers could have a greater presence on our transport network and on our streets. During the next few days, the military will return to their original positions.
To discuss the latest attacks in Europe, let's introduce this week's guest, Dr. Martin Sherman, founder and executive director of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
We just heard there the terror threat in the country being lowered. What does this mean regarding the potential for another attack in the UK or, in fact, across Europe?
Well, I'm not sure that it has really operational significance. I'm not sure that the terminology here is what determines the threat on the ground. It probably means that they have no specific intelligence as to a defined attack which is about to take place. But beyond that, I wouldn't allow myself to be much more reassured as compared to what I was when the critical status was in place.
So how do you think Britain can prevent these kind of attacks, especially at key sites and in confined places like the London Underground?
Well, I think rather than focusing on the operational or the procedural issues, I think the point of departure should be the conceptual and the ideological, because that will define how robustly you address the threat. And I think what we're seeing is an ongoing assault on the validity of multiculturalism and political correctness and moral relevance. And unless you can define the threat accurately and not shy away from saying that the threat emanates from the ideology of extreme or Muslim extremism, it doesn't matter what you do, you will never be able to contain it.
So how can you fight an extremist ideology, though, Dr. Sherman? How can you fight an ideology, especially when it's taking place online in places like that? How can you tackle such a thing?
Well, first of all, you have to define the need to tackle it. Up until now, especially in America and in Western Europe, there's been a reluctance to define the threat and saying that it's not Islam, it's not Muslim extremism, it's a perverted version of Islam. But that's not really true.
What do you mean it's not true?
Well, the extremists grow and are nourished by the environment.
By very definition, they're extremists. They're not the norm.
Yes, there's an excellent video out by Rahil Raza. It's called By the Numbers. And this gives a very clear analysis of who actually supports the extremist Muslim ideology. She starts from the outer circles and goes in further and further and further. But if there was not widespread support for this radical ideology, it wouldn't be sustained. And I think what you need now is once you've defined the threat, then you can tailor your intelligence collection and your penetration of intelligence into the sources of violence. Without that, you're basically crippling yourself.
Let's take it back to the Parsons Green attack. ISIS claimed responsibility for the attempted massacre, which it claimed was carried out by soldiers of the Caliphate. But actually no evidence so far of their direct involvement. What does this say about their strategy?
Well, I think they'll do it, but I don't see a large response from the British Muslim community denouncing it. And this is what I'm saying. Until moderate Muslims rise up against the extremism, this will carry on. And so what you need, beyond the operational effort, beyond the procedural effort, you need an ideological and cultural assault on the sources on which this ideology is based. And this means a complete shift in intellectual approach towards the phenomena. Otherwise, I think we're going to find Western Europe and the UK in a very difficult position.
All right, Dr. Sherman, we'll leave it there for now, but stay with us as we move on to regional news. And Syrian and Hezbollah troops have marched across the Euphrates River over Russian-imported pontoon bridges, arriving at the eastern bank after breaking an ISIS siege in Deir ez-Zor. This despite a US-led coalition threat to strike any Syrian army units should they try to cross the river. It was a warning issued by the US-led coalition's deputy commander the same day newly arrived Russian armaments landed in Syria. Those armaments include the MiG-29 SMT, codenamed by NATO as Fulcrum. It's a powerful twin-engine fighter. But before we discuss the latest developments with this week's studio guest, this statement from a top aide to Bashar al-Assad saying the government would fight any force, including US-backed militias, in an effort to recapture the rest of the country.
يعني قوات سوريا الديمقراطية أو محاولتها أن تسيطر على أراضي في الأيام الأخيرة لاحظنا أنها حلت محل داعش في كثير من الأماكن دون أي قتال، ولذلك يعني سواء كانت قوات سوريا الديمقراطية أو قوات داعش أو أي قوى أجنبية غير شرعية موجودة في البلد تدعم هؤلاء، فنحن سوف نناضل ونعمل ضد هؤلاء إلى أن تتحرر أرضنا كاملة من أي معتد على هذه الأرض.
Dr. Sherman, Syria, they're saying their government units backed by Moscow have already crossed the Euphrates in an effort to recover eastern Syria. That was supposed to be the US-led coalition side of the offensive. They were advancing from the opposite side of the river to Moscow. Does that mean Russia has nullified the two-year deal with the US where the river is divides Syria into US-ruled and Russian-ruled areas? And what does that mean for who will control it at the end of the battle?
Well, I think we discussed this in an earlier program once. The Russians and the Iranians will do anything that they can, irrespective of any agreement that they have. And unless they're faced by a very persuasive show of counterforce, they will do whatever they feel they can do. And I believe that unless they're faced with stiff resistance, obviously backed by the US, they will continue their push eastward until Assad gains as much control over Syria as he can.
Will the US give them that stiff resistance, though, Dr. Sherman? Do you think the US is going to give them that stiff resistance?
Well, I'm not particularly optimistic about that. I think that given the experience of the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan, it will be very difficult for the US to muster enough domestic support to get it to be engaged in a serious engagement with Iran and Russia, certainly with both of them.
Do you think there's a chance then that the US and Russia may fight it out on the ground? Actually, even this weekend, we saw Washington accuse Moscow of carrying out an airstrike that wounded members of the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces. That was in Deir ez-Zor. Russia's denying this, but it is an example of potential flashpoints, isn't it?
Definitely. But again, you know, we discussed this before the program. It's very difficult to decouple what's going on here from what's happened with Iran and the way that the agreement signed by the Obama administration actually empowered the Iranians militarily, enriched them economically, and entrenched them politically. Because this is the kind of thing that I don't think would happen without Iranian support. And Iranian support is only forthcoming because of the empowerment that it's received from the agreement that was signed with the Obama administration. I think it's the first of the, well, not the first, but certainly a continuation of the bitter fruits that we're going to harvest from that agreement.
Bashar al-Assad saying he's ready to fight to recapture the parts of Syria he's lost over the last 6 years, talking about strengthening of allies. He and his allies appear to be upping their ante in the war. Are we seeing the beginning of the end here?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure we're seeing the beginning of the end, but certainly this is a completely different scenario than people would have imagined in, say, 2011, when many people, even in Israel, senior military figures here, were predicting that Assad would fall within 3 or 4 months. So I think this illustrates how dangerous it is to make predictions in this region when it comes to political and strategic outcomes.
Indeed. What about Israel, though? It's threatened to act against Iranian presence on its northern border. Are we going to see Israel step up its game, given the gains being made by the Syrian government and its allies?
Well, I'm not sure. They may have no option. I'm sure that Israel will be very loath to get into an engagement with Iran, but it may have no option, which, of course, again, shows how fortunate it was that Israel didn't withdraw from the Golan and hand it over to Syrian forces, because we might be facing a much more precarious situation today if we'd done that.
OK, Dr. Martin Sherman of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies, thanks so much for joining us for this week's edition.
Thank you for inviting me once again.
Meanwhile, the Russian Air Force in Syria is under new orders to respond directly and immediately to demands for strikes from Iranian and Syrian field commanders. This means they no longer have to obtain prior approval from Russian high commands in Latakia or Moscow. That empowers those on the ground. It led to Washington accusing Moscow of bombing US-backed Syrian forces in Deir ez-Zor, eastern Syria, this weekend. The new order comes after the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu sat down with Bashar al-Assad in Damascus and secretly with Iran's Revolutionary Guards leaders in Tehran the next day. Also on the agenda, a timetable to recapture the ISIS strongholds of Abu Kamal and Mayadin with heavy Russian air cover. In Tehran, the defense minister ensuring Iran's Iraqi militia, the Popular Mobilization Units, or PMU, will be ready to link up with the Syrian Hezbollah forces outside the Iraqi border town of Al-Qaim. And Russia has announced that the Syrian army has recovered 85% of land captured by the opposition and extremists. Debka military and intelligence sources saying Russia and the Syrian government so confident of their victory that Bashar al-Assad and his allies are deep in preparations for what they are calling an historic event, scheduled for a date as early as mid-October. It's set to be staged in the Iraqi town of Al-Qaim on the banks of the Euphrates in the Anbar province. That's a town still held by ISIS militants. The allies are reportedly planning a victory parade of the 4 allied armies and a speech by Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Bashar al-Assad and Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah. Moving to Egypt, where ISIS attacked an Egyptian command convoy in northern Sinai near the provincial capital of Al-Arish, killing 18 soldiers of the Egyptian army. The attack turned into a gunfight and militants also opened fire on ambulance workers. Debka military and intelligence sources say this is the first attack conducted by ISIS in an orderly military battalion formation and also succeeded in blowing up so-called guaranteed bomb-proof American armoured vehicles. Egyptian analysts examining the IED traps hidden on the highway say it was the most powerful explosive materials employed so far by militants in the region. Officials stress that the Sinai jihadists were new arrivals from the Euphrates Valley, which straddles the Syrian-Iraqi border. And finally, it's known as the strangest place in the world. Socotra Island, 220 miles off the coast of Yemen, is an isolated place of odd and beautiful endangered plants and animals, and listed as a UNESCO Heritage Site. But it's also in the sights of the United Arab Emirates, who are in the middle of a huge project to transform the island into its main air, sea and special forces base. The UAE won a 99-year lease to Socotra from Yemen's Western-backed president, Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi, just before he fled to Riyadh in 2014. Now it's set to be the location for the Central Command Centre for the UAE's 6 naval bases in the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean. Now, another one of those military bases is on the Yemeni mainland itself, the port of Mukalla, just opposite Socotra. Critics saying the UAE has so-called colonized the Yemeni island. Well, that wraps up this part of this week's show. Now for the news in brief. A heavyweight American delegation travelled to Duhok in the northern Kyrgyzstan region Thursday to dissuade President Masoud Barzani from holding the independence referendum set to be held on September 25th. It soon deteriorated into a shouting match when the US Special Presidential Envoy for the anti-ISIS coalition threatened to cut off US aid if the Kurds go ahead with the vote. Barzani saying the Kurds would never again yield to US pressure and vowed to forge ahead with the referendum. More than 1,300 Syrian families, that's roughly 6,500 people, have left refugee camps in Jordan and crossed back into their home country's southern province of Daraa in recent weeks. This as Russian-monitored ceasefire there enters its 3rd month. The ceasefire covering Daraa, Quneitra and Suwaida, brokered by Russia, the US and Jordan, took effect on July 9th. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has launched a crackdown targeting some 30 clerics, as well as public critics and political rivals. It marks one of the biggest mass arrests of its kind in the kingdom's recent history. Opposition figures calling for demonstrations against human rights violations, but amid a heavy security deployment. And Harvard University has withdrawn a visiting fellowship invitation to Chelsea Manning, a US Army soldier convicted of leaking classified data. This after former acting and deputy director of the CIA and a senior fellow at the university, Michael Morrell, stepped down from his teaching position over the invitation. The university has, however, maintained its offer for Manning to speak at Harvard, who tweeted, quote, "good," after Morrell resigned, adding that Harvard, quote, "chills marginalized voices under CIA pressure." Well, that's it for this week's edition of the Debka Files. For more on stories you heard here and more, sign up for the Debka weekly newsletter at debka.com/weekly. Thanks for being with us. That's it from me and the team here at the ILTV studios in Tel Aviv. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with another edition of the Debka Files. Goodbye for now.